Your Majesty, the kingdom can survive a budget crisis. It can survive a trade dispute. What it cannot survive is your wolf abandoning royal meetings for a cat. The words echoed through the council chamber, and for the first time in years, not a single advisor dared look directly at Alpha King Adrian Blackwood. Adrian sat motionless at the head of the long oak table, his silver eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the palace windows. Normally, that silence alone would have ended any discussion. Today, it only made the situation more embarrassing. Because unfortunately, the councilman was right. 3 weeks ago, Adrian's wolf, Fenrir, had started acting strangely. It began with small things. A restless feeling during meetings. A sudden urge to leave important conversations halfway through. Then came the pacing. Endless pacing. Fenrir would grow distracted by a scent Adrian couldn't identify. Every instinct inside him pulling towards something beyond the palace walls. At first, Adrian assumed it was a territorial issue. Perhaps a rogue wolf had entered the northern territories. Perhaps an unknown alpha was testing boundaries. Those possibilities would have been far easier to explain. Instead, after several days of investigation, the truth had emerged. Fenrir was obsessed with a cat. Not a magical creature. Not a sacred guardian. Just a regular house cat. Adrian slowly rubbed a hand across his jaw as another advisor cleared his throat. The reports are consistent, Your Majesty. A stack of papers slid across the table. Your wolf has been spotted near Maple Street 7 times this week. Adrian didn't answer, because that number was probably low. Fenrir had become impossible to manage. The wolf that normally viewed the world with calm confidence now behaved like an overexcited puppy whenever that particular scent appeared. It was ridiculous, humiliating, completely unprecedented. Across the room, several council members exchanged nervous glances. Nobody wanted to laugh. Nobody wanted to be the person who mocked the Alpha King. Yet Adrian could practically feel their curiosity filling the chamber. Finally, he pushed back his chair and stood. The room instantly fell. Silent. 6'4" and built like a man carved from winter itself. Adrian carried the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. The meeting is over, he said calmly. Relief flashed across multiple faces. Then Fenrir stirred inside him. The sensation hit like a sudden pull on an invisible thread. Adrian froze. There it was again. That scent. Warm. Familiar. Infuriating. Fenrir practically lit up with excitement. Go. Adrian clenched his jaw. Absolutely not. Go. We have responsibilities. Go. Adrian exhaled slowly through his nose. The council members watched him with growing confusion as an entire silent argument unfolded between king and wolf. Fenrir was stubborn. Adrian was more stubborn. Usually. Today, however, the wolf seemed determined to win. Before Adrian could suppress the instinct, his feet were already moving toward the palace doors. Your Majesty, someone called cautiously. Adrian paused. His expression remained perfectly neutral. There is an urgent matter requiring my attention. No one questioned him. No one was brave enough. 10 minutes later, a black SUV rolled through the rainy streets of Ashford City. Adrian sat in the back seat, staring out the window while Fenrir vibrated with anticipation. The pull grew stronger with every block. Stronger. Closer. Until the vehicle finally stopped near a quiet brick apartment building lined with flower boxes and narrow sidewalks. Adrian stepped onto the wet pavement. The rain had softened into a mist. Fenrir immediately focused on a second-floor window. There. Adrian followed the feeling. And that was when he saw it. A fluffy gray cat sitting in the window like it owned the entire world. The cat glanced down. Their eyes met. Fenrir practically melted with happiness. The cat looked deeply annoyed. The gray cat continued staring down from the second-floor window, as if Alpha King Adrian Blackwood was nothing more than an inconvenience blocking its view. Most creatures reacted differently to his presence. Wolves lowered their eyes. People stepped aside. Entire rooms became quieter when he entered them. This cat looked at him with the same expression someone might reserve for an overdue utility. Bill. Fenrir, meanwhile, was completely enchanted. The wolf's excitement buzzed through Adrian like electricity. The feeling was so absurd that Adrian almost questioned his own sanity. Then the cat slowly turned around and walked away from the window. Fenrir immediately panicked. Follow him. Adrian folded his arms. Absolutely not. Follow him. We are not following a cat. The wolf ignored his protest and continued pacing restlessly inside his mind. Adrian had faced political crises, economic negotiations, and years of royal responsibility. Somehow none of them had prepared him for arguing with his own wolf about a house cat. A movement behind the glass caught his attention. A woman appeared inside the apartment. She carried a sketchbook tucked beneath one arm and a coffee mug in her hand. Light brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders. Her oversized sweater looked comfortable enough to sleep in, and her expression carried the exhausted patience of someone accustomed to dealing with daily chaos. She stopped beside the cat. The cat immediately sat down and began loudly demanding attention. Adrian watched as she rolled her eyes. "You literally ate 20 minutes ago," she said. The cat meowed again. "No," another meow. Still no. Finner seemed fascinated. Adrian was less interested in the cat and more curious about the woman. There was something unexpectedly calming about her presence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing supernatural. Just a quiet warmth that stood out against the constant pressure of his life. Down on the sidewalk, the royal driver shifted nervously beside the SUV. "Your Majesty?" Adrian did not look away from the window. "Yes." "How long are we observing the cat?" Adrian closed his eyes briefly. That question alone guaranteed this situation would eventually become palace gossip. 5 more minutes. The driver nodded with remarkable professionalism. Inside the apartment, the woman disappeared into another room. The cat remained. It jumped onto the windowsill again and resumed staring directly at Adrian. This time the look seemed even more judgmental. Finner practically glowed with happiness. The cat blinked once, then deliberately turned its back. Adrian actually felt the rejection through his wolf. For several seconds neither of them moved. Finally Finner spoke again. "He likes us." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "He absolutely does not. He is shy." Adrian stared at the cat. The cat flicked its tail dismissively. The evidence suggested otherwise. Several blocks away, completely unaware she had become the focus of royal attention, Evelyn Parker settled onto her couch. Rain tapped softly against the windows while she reviewed sketches for a children's book project due later that week. Across the room, Machi lounged dramatically across an entire cushion despite weighing less than 15 pounds. "You know," Evelyn said, glancing up from her work, "one day somebody is going to meet you and think I raised you wrong." Machi opened one eye. "Exactly my point." The cat yawned and returned to doing absolutely nothing. Outside, Adrian finally turned toward the waiting SUV. He should have left hours ago. There was no logical reason to remain. No explanation for why Finner felt drawn here. Yet as he reached for the door handle, the strange sensation returned. Not from the cat this time. Something softer. Fainter. It came from somewhere inside that apartment. And for the first time since this ridiculous situation began, Adrian found himself wondering whether Finner had been chasing the wrong creature all along. The next morning, Adrian attempted to return to normal life. It lasted exactly 23 minutes. The council chamber was filled with discussions about transportation contracts, infrastructure projects, and upcoming regional elections. Important matters. Necessary matters. Adrian sat at the head of the table listening with his usual focus while sunlight streamed through the tall palace windows. At least, he appeared focused. Inside, Finner was completely distracted. "She is awake." Adrian ignored him. She made coffee. Adrian continued reviewing a report. She burned the toast. Adrian lowered the document slightly. "How do you know that?" Finner sounded pleased with himself. "I can smell it." Adrian stared at the report without actually reading a single word. 3 weeks ago his wolf had been a respected apex predator. Now it was apparently monitoring breakfast activities from 3 miles away. Across the table, a councilwoman paused mid-sentence. "Your Majesty?" Adrian blinked. "Continue." She hesitated before resuming her presentation. Finner, meanwhile, remained completely uninterested in politics. "She is laughing." Adrian rubbed his temple. The wolf's fascination was becoming impossible to ignore. More troubling was the fact that the strange pull had grown stronger overnight. Not toward the cat, toward Evelyn Parker. He knew her name now. The Royal Intelligence Office had quietly gathered information after his visit the previous evening. Evelyn was 24 years old. Freelance illustrator. No criminal record. No unusual history. No known connection to the supernatural world. By all available evidence, she was completely ordinary. Yet every instinct inside Finner insisted otherwise. The meeting finally ended shortly before noon. Adrian stood immediately. Several advisors exchanged worried glances. They all knew what came next. One brave councilman cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, are you heading to another urgent matter?" Adrian looked directly at him. "Yes." The councilman nodded carefully. "Of course." Nobody asked further questions. 40 minutes later, Adrian found himself walking down Maple Street in a dark coat and sunglasses, attempting something he rarely experienced: anonymity. The neighborhood was peaceful. Families pushed strollers. Cyclists passed by. A bakery filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. Normal people living normal lives. Then Fenrir suddenly froze. There. Adrian followed the sensation. Across the street, Evelyn emerged from a small bookstore carrying a paper bag. Her hair moved gently in the afternoon breeze. She looked exactly like someone enjoying a quiet Saturday. Nothing about her suggested she was currently causing a constitutional crisis inside the royal palace. Adrian watched as she checked her phone and started walking. Fenrir immediately became alert. "Follow her. We are not stalking anyone. We are observing." That is significantly worse. Before the argument could continue, another familiar figure appeared. Machi sat inside the front window of a nearby pet supply store. The cat looked remarkably pleased with himself. Evelyn stopped outside the glass. "How did you get in there?" she asked. Machi responded with a loud meow. "No, seriously." Another meow. "You were at home 30 minutes ago." The cat offered no explanation. Adrian watched the exchange from half a block away. To his complete disbelief, Fenrir became excited again. The wolf adored that cat. Machi finally noticed Adrian standing in the distance. Green eyes narrowed instantly. The cat seemed to recognize him. Then, with deliberate disrespect, Machi turned around and presented his back. Adrian actually felt offended. Fenrir, however, looked delighted. "He likes us." Adrian sighed heavily. At this point, he was beginning to suspect his wolf had lost every remaining shred of dignity. Then Evelyn suddenly looked up. For a brief moment, her eyes met his across the crowded sidewalk. Everything inside Fenrir went completely silent. The strange pull tightened. The world seemed to pause. And for the first time, Adrian had the unmistakable feeling that she had sensed something too. For a moment, neither of them looked away. The sounds of traffic, conversations, and passing footsteps seemed to fade into the background. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk holding her paper bag while Adrian remained half a block away. She had never seen him before. At least she was fairly certain she had not. Yet something about him felt strangely familiar. Not familiar enough to recognize. Familiar enough to notice. Then Machi ruined the moment. The cat suddenly let out an impatient meow from inside the pet store window and began pawing dramatically at the glass. Evelyn blinked and looked away. Whatever strange feeling had appeared vanished instantly. "Right," she muttered. "You are somehow the priority again." Inside the store, Machi looked very pleased with himself. Adrian watched her enter the building while Fenrir practically vibrated with excitement. "We should go inside." "No." "Why not?" "Because normal people do not follow strangers into pet stores." Fenrir appeared unconvinced. Adrian stood there another few seconds before finally turning away. Unfortunately, the universe seemed determined to make his day worse. "Your Majesty?" Adrian closed his eyes. That voice belonged to Marcus Hawthorne, one of the younger members of the Royal Council. Slowly, Adrian turned around. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk holding a coffee cup and wearing the exact expression of a man who had accidentally discovered classified information. "Marcus, I was not expecting to see you here." "Neither was I." Marcus glanced toward the pet store. Then back to Adrian. Then toward the pet store again. Adrian could practically hear the rumors forming inside his head. "This conversation never happened," Adrian said calmly. Marcus nodded immediately. "Absolutely." He paused. "Should I also forget the cat?" Adrian's silence answered the question. Several hours later, the story had somehow already spread through half the palace. Not officially. Nobody would ever openly gossip about the Alpha King. Unofficially, however, several employees suddenly found reasons to visit Maple Street during lunch breaks. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained completely unaware of the growing chaos surrounding her life. She spent the afternoon working on illustrations while rain clouds gathered outside her apartment. By early evening, she finally stretched and closed her laptop. "Dinner time," she announced. Machi immediately appeared from nowhere. One moment the cat had been asleep. The next he stood directly beside her. You are genuinely unsettling. Machi meowed. No, I do not believe teleportation is a normal cat ability. The cat ignored her. As always. After dinner, Evelyn settled onto the couch with a book while Machi occupied his favorite position across her legs. Everything felt peaceful, comfortable, ordinary. Then Machi suddenly sat upright. His ears twitched. His attention locked onto the apartment door. Evelyn frowned. What is it? The cat jumped down and trotted toward the entrance. For several seconds, he simply stared at the door. Then he let out a short, annoyed sound. Curious, Evelyn stood and looked through the peephole. Her eyebrows rose. Standing in the hallway was the same man she had noticed earlier that afternoon. Tall, dark coat, silver eyes she somehow remembered despite only seeing them once. He held a small package in one hand. Evelyn stared at the door. Outside, Adrian questioned every decision that had led him to this moment. In theory, delivering the misplaced sketchbook Machi had somehow dragged into the hallway yesterday sounded reasonable. In practice, it sounded significantly less reasonable now that he was standing outside her apartment. Fenrir, however, seemed delighted. She is here. I am aware. Knock. Adrian hesitated. Inside the apartment, Machi looked up at Evelyn. Outside the apartment, Fenrir looked up at Adrian. Both animals appeared to be waiting. Neither human seemed particularly prepared for what happened next. The silence stretched for several seconds. Evelyn stood behind the apartment door with one hand resting on the knob, while Machi sat beside her feet like a furry security consultant. Outside, Adrian stared at the package in his hand and wondered how a ruler responsible for millions of people had somehow become nervous about knocking on a single apartment door. Fenrir had no such concerns. Knock. Adrian exhaled slowly and tapped the door. The sound seemed far louder than it should have been. A second later, the door opened. Evelyn looked just as surprised as he felt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian held up the package. I believe this belongs to you. Evelyn glanced down. Her eyes widened. My sketchbook. Adrian nodded. Your cat appears to have left it in the hallway. Evelyn immediately looked down at Machi. You did what? Machi blinked innocently. The performance was impressive considering everyone involved knew he was guilty. Thank you, Evelyn said, accepting the sketchbook. I thought I lost this. You are welcome. Another awkward silence followed. Adrian was usually excellent in social situations. Negotiations, interviews, public appearances. None of those experiences seemed particularly helpful now. Fenrir, meanwhile, was focused entirely on the cat. There he is. Adrian resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Machi appeared significantly less enthusiastic. The gray cat stared at Adrian for several seconds before turning around and walking deeper into the apartment without acknowledging him. Fenrir looked delighted. He came to greet us. He absolutely did not. Evelyn laughed softly. Sorry, he is not very friendly. I noticed. Actually, that was unusually polite for him. Adrian found himself smiling despite everything. It was a rare expression, one that few people ever saw. Something about Evelyn made it easier than expected. She seemed to notice too because her smile briefly widened. Then Machi suddenly returned carrying a toy mouse in his mouth. He dropped it directly at Adrian's feet. Both humans looked down. The cat stared expectantly. I do not know what this means, Adrian admitted. Evelyn looked horrified. Oh no. What? He wants you to throw it. Adrian blinked. Excuse me. If you throw it once, he will decide you belong to him forever. Machi meowed loudly, as if confirming the statement. Fenrir immediately approved. Throw it. Absolutely not. Throw it. Adrian looked at the cat. The cat looked back. Somewhere during the last month his life had become completely unreasonable. 10 minutes later, Adrian found himself standing in Evelyn's living room, throwing a toy mouse across the floor, while Machi chased it with surprising enthusiasm. Fenrir was thrilled. Adrian was questioning every choice that had led him here. Evelyn sat on the couch, trying unsuccessfully not to laugh. You are taking this remarkably well. Adrian picked up the toy again. I have learned that resistance appears ineffective. That is exactly how he wins. Machi returned proudly with the toy and dropped it at Adrian's shoes again. The cycle continued. By the fifth throw, Evelyn was openly laughing. The sound caught Adrian off guard. It was warm, genuine, easy. For someone whose days were usually filled with schedules, expectations, and endless responsibilities. The simplicity of the moment felt strangely refreshing. Then Adrian's phone rang. The screen displayed the name Marcus Hawthorne. Adrian immediately knew this would not be good news. He answered. What? Marcus sounded far too cheerful. Your Majesty, I thought you should know that someone posted a photo online. Adrian felt a sudden sense of dread. What photo? There was a pause. The one of you entering a pet store yesterday. Adrian closed his eyes. How bad is it? Another pause. The headline currently says the mysterious silver-eyed man chosen by the judgmental cat has returned. Across the room, Evelyn nearly dropped her coffee laughing. And for reasons Adrian could not fully explain, hearing her laugh somehow made the situation feel much less terrible. The next morning, Adrian discovered that the internet had somehow made everything worse. He walked into the palace conference room expecting updates on trade agreements and regional development projects. Instead, every conversation stopped the second he entered. Silence filled the room. Several advisors suddenly became fascinated by their coffee cups. One man appeared deeply invested in studying the ceiling. Adrian narrowed his eyes. What happened? Nobody answered. That alone was suspicious. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. Good morning, Your Majesty. Adrian sat down slowly. Marcus, wonderful weather today. Marcus, the younger advisor sighed. There are approximately 3 million views on the cat photo now. Adrian closed his eyes. Fenrir found the situation hilarious. The wolf had become increasingly cheerful ever since meeting Evelyn. Unfortunately, that happiness appeared directly linked to Adrian's growing embarrassment. Across social media, complete strangers were discussing whether the mysterious silver-eyed man was worthy of the famously judgmental cat from Maple Street. Nobody knew the truth. Most people assumed Adrian was simply some wealthy businessman. That misunderstanding was currently the only thing protecting the royal family's dignity. Meanwhile, several hundred miles away from palace politics, Evelyn sat in a neighborhood coffee shop trying to finish a new illustration project. Unfortunately, concentration had become difficult, not because of work, because her phone kept receiving messages. Her best friend Rachel had already sent 16 texts before 9 o'clock. The 17th arrived seconds later. Tell me everything. Evelyn typed a response. There is nothing to tell. Rachel replied immediately. A handsome, mysterious man showed up at your apartment and played fetch with Machi. That is absolutely something to tell. Evelyn groaned softly and put her phone away. Across from her, Machi occupied an entire chair like a tiny executive attending an important meeting. The cat wore a blue harness and looked deeply unimpressed by humanity. This is your fault, Evelyn informed him. Machi ignored her. As usual, the bell above the cafe door rang. Evelyn glanced up casually, then nearly dropped her pencil. Adrian had just walked inside. He paused after spotting her. The surprise on his face mirrored her own. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then Machi noticed him. The cat immediately stood. Adrian noticed the reaction. Fenrir became excited. There he is. See, he missed us. Adrian remained skeptical. Yet something interesting happened next. Machi walked directly past Evelyn, past several customers, past an employee carrying a tray of pastries. Then he stopped beside Adrian's shoes and sat down. The entire cafe watched. Evelyn stared. Adrian stared. Machi stared at Adrian like a manager waiting for an overdue report. I think he wants you to sit down, Evelyn said. Adrian looked at the cat. You are probably right. 5 minutes later, they shared a small table near the window. Conversation came easier than either expected. Evelyn talked about illustration work. Adrian listened. Adrian asked questions. Evelyn answered. The hours seemed strangely lighter than usual. Several times she caught herself smiling. Several times Adrian realized he had completely forgotten about palace responsibilities. Fenrir remained unusually quiet throughout most of the conversation. Not distracted. Not excited. Simply content. As though being near Evelyn eased something neither of them fully understood. Then Adrian noticed a silver pendant hanging around her neck. The instant he saw it, something shifted inside him. The strange pull that had haunted him for weeks suddenly grew stronger. Sharper. More focused. Fenrir immediately became alert. Adrian tried to hide his reaction. That necklace, he said carefully. Evelyn touched the pendant automatically. This? Where did you get it? Her expression softened. My grandmother gave it to me years ago. Adrian could not explain why the answer mattered. He only knew that for the first time since all of this began, Fenrir seemed absolutely certain of something. And that certainty had nothing to do with the cat. Adrian did not mention the pendant again for the rest of the afternoon, but the image remained fixed in his mind long after he and Evelyn left the cafe. The silver charm was simple, almost ordinary at first glance, yet something about it felt familiar. Ancient. Important. Fenrir had noticed it too. The wolf remained unusually alert during the drive back to the palace. By evening, Adrian found himself standing in the private royal archives, surrounded by shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Few people knew the collection existed. Fewer still had permission to enter. Ancient journals, family records, and forgotten histories filled the room. Adrian rarely visited unless absolutely necessary. Tonight felt necessary. Across town, Evelyn sat cross-legged on her couch, while Machi occupied the exact center of a blanket he had no intention of sharing. She attempted to focus on a new illustration commission. Unfortunately, her thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. Specifically, toward a certain silver-eyed stranger who somehow managed to be both intimidating and surprisingly easy to talk to. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. Machi opened one eye. "No, I do not need relationship advice from a cat." Machi closed his eye again, clearly offended by the suggestion. Back at the palace, Adrian finally found what he was searching for. An old journal belonging to his grandfather. The leather cover had faded with age. Several pages threatened to fall apart when touched. Adrian carefully turned through the entries until a familiar symbol caught his attention. His pulse slowed, then stopped. The drawing on the page matched the shape engraved into Evelyn's pendant almost perfectly. Fenrir immediately stirred. Adrian read the passage twice, then a third time. According to the journal, generations ago a small group of families had been entrusted with protective artifacts connected to ancient bonds between human and wolf bloodlines. Most historians considered the story little more than folklore. Yet the symbol existed. The pendant existed. And Evelyn wore one. Fenrir seemed completely certain now. Not the cat. Adrian stared at the page. Not the cat. Suddenly dozens of strange events began making more sense. The pull. The fascination. The constant need to stay close. Fenrir had sensed Evelyn from the beginning. Machi had simply been impossible to ignore because he never left her side. The realization should have been relieving. Instead, it created an entirely new problem, because Adrian still had no idea what any of it actually meant. The next morning brought another surprise. Evelyn opened her apartment door and nearly tripped over a delivery box sitting outside. "What now?" she muttered. The package carried no sender information. Curious, she brought it inside. Machi immediately inspected it with professional suspicion. Inside was a collection of expensive cat toys. Very expensive cat toys. Evelyn stared. Absolutely not. Machi was already examining them. Do not even think about it. The cat had clearly begun thinking about it. Attached to the package was a simple note. For Machi. Regards, Adrian. Evelyn laughed despite herself. Somewhere in the city, Adrian received a photograph 20 minutes later. It showed Machi sitting proudly among the new toys like a king reviewing tribute from loyal subjects. The message beneath the picture contained only 4 words. "He approves your offering." Adrian surprised himself by smiling. Fenrir looked equally pleased. Neither of them noticed the elderly woman studying an old photograph in a retirement community across town. The woman held a younger picture of Evelyn's grandmother beside another image taken decades earlier. Her expression slowly changed from curiosity to astonishment. "Well," she whispered softly, "that explains far more than it should." 3 days later, the quiet rhythm that had settled between Adrian and Evelyn began to change. It started with small things. Strange questions from strangers. Curious looks that lingered a little too long. Twice, Evelyn noticed unfamiliar people photographing the pendant around her neck before quickly looking away. Individually, each incident felt harmless. Together, they felt unsettling. She tried convincing herself she was imagining it. By Friday afternoon, that explanation no longer worked. Evelyn was leaving an art supply store when her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "We need to discuss the pendant." Her stomach tightened. There was no signature. No explanation. Just the message. She immediately deleted it. Across town, Adrian was halfway through a meeting when Fenrir suddenly became alert. Something is wrong. Adrian straightened slightly. The wolf's instincts rarely reacted without reason. "What is it?" I do not know, but she is worried. Adrian glanced toward the window. The uneasy feeling reached him a moment later. It was faint, almost impossible to explain, yet undeniably present. Before he could investigate further, his phone vibrated. An incoming message from Evelyn. Have you ever had the feeling that someone knows something about you that you do not know yourself? Adrian stared at the screen. Then he stood up. The meeting ended immediately. 45 minutes later, he found Evelyn sitting on a park bench overlooking a small lake surrounded by autumn trees. Machi occupied the bench beside her like an unusually judgmental bodyguard. The cat noticed Adrian first. For once, he did not turn away. Instead, Machi remained exactly where he was, watching carefully. Fenrir approved. Adrian sat beside Evelyn. You look concerned. She handed him her phone. Adrian read the message. His expression remained calm, but something cold settled into his thoughts. Has anything else happened? Evelyn nodded slowly. A few strange things this week. People asking questions. Looking at the pendant. She touched the silver charm unconsciously. I keep feeling like I am missing part of a story. Adrian understood that feeling better than she realized. Before he could answer, another voice interrupted them. That is because you are. Both turned toward the speaker. An elderly woman approached along the walking path carrying a small leather photo album. Her silver hair moved gently in the breeze. Her expression held equal parts determination and relief. I have been trying to find you for days, she said softly. Evelyn blinked in confusion. Do I know you? No, the woman smiled. But I knew your grandmother. Silence followed. Even Machi seemed unusually attentive. The woman opened the album and carefully removed an old photograph. She handed it to Evelyn. The picture showed two young women standing beside a lake decades earlier. One was unmistakably Evelyn's grandmother. The other wore the exact same pendant hanging around Evelyn's neck. Your family protected something important for generations, the woman said. The pendant was never just jewelry. Adrian felt Fenrir become completely still. Beside him, Evelyn stared at the photograph with widening eyes. Questions filled her expression. Questions she had carried for years without realizing it. The woman looked from Evelyn to Adrian and smiled knowingly. And if I am correct, she said gently, the pendant is not the only thing that finally found where it belongs. For the first time, Machi did not look annoyed. He simply climbed into Evelyn's lap and settled there quietly while the evening sunlight reflected across the lake like liquid gold. The answers arrived slowly after that evening by the lake. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic revelation. Instead, they came through old photographs, handwritten letters, and stories that had nearly been forgotten with time. Evelyn learned that her grandmother had belonged to a small group of families entrusted with preserving ancient connections between worlds that rarely crossed paths anymore. The pendant had never been magical in the way fairy tales described. It was a symbol, a promise passed from one generation to the next, a reminder that some bonds were meant to guide people toward one another when the time was right. For Adrian, the discovery brought an unexpected sense of peace. For weeks he had been trying to solve a mystery that refused to make sense. Now, sitting across from Evelyn on a quiet Sunday afternoon, everything suddenly felt simple. Not easy, just simple. Fenrir had recognized something important long before either of them understood it. The wolf had sensed the connection first. The problem was that Machi happened to be standing directly in front of it the entire time. Fenrir remained unapologetic about this. Several days later, Adrian finally told Evelyn the truth about who he really was. He expected shock, questions, possibly even frustration. Instead, she stared at him for several seconds before laughing. You were telling me I spent a month explaining cat behavior to a king. Adrian nodded. Yes. And you let me do that? You seemed confident. Evelyn laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. Fenrir enjoyed every second of it. So did Adrian. The weeks that followed brought changes neither of them had expected. Some were large. Most were surprisingly small. Adrian discovered he enjoyed ordinary afternoons more than formal banquets. Evelyn discovered that palace staff secretly shared photos of Machi in group chats. Marcus Hawthorne somehow became unofficially responsible for documenting the cat's activities. Entire sections of the palace gradually adapted to Machi's preferences. This was considered a questionable decision by everyone except Machi. The cat considered it excellent leadership. One evening, several months later, Adrian stood on a palace balcony, watching the city lights shimmer beneath the night sky. Evelyn stepped beside him carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without a word, she handed one to him. The familiar comfort of the moment settled naturally between them. "Do you ever think about how strange all of this was?" she asked softly. Adrian smiled. "Every day. Your wolf followed my cat across half the city. Yes. People on the internet still think Machi chose you. Also yes." Evelyn shook her head, laughing quietly. "That is ridiculous." Adrian looked toward the balcony door. Inside, Fenrir lay peacefully near the fireplace, while Machi occupied the most expensive chair in the room. The arrangement had remained surprisingly consistent. Fenrir still adored the cat. Machi still acted as though tolerating everyone around him required significant personal sacrifice. Yet somehow it worked. "I think," Adrian said thoughtfully, "that some things happen exactly the way they are supposed to." Evelyn leaned lightly against his shoulder. "Even the ridiculous parts. Especially the ridiculous parts." Inside the room, Machi opened one eye and noticed them standing together. After several seconds of evaluation, he appeared satisfied. Then he immediately climbed onto Adrian's favorite chair and claimed it for himself. Fenrir looked delighted. Adrian sighed. Evelyn laughed. And beneath the warm palace lights, surrounded by ordinary happiness neither of them had expected to find, life moved forward exactly as it should. The king found the person he was meant to meet. The wolf found the connection it had sensed from the beginning. And the cat remained completely convinced that everyone involved worked for him.